Morning, everyone. Let me just. Okay. Good. Okay. Good morning. So, we're going to take a look this morning. The COVID-19 vaccine and halacha, obligatory or optional. I should say at the outset that originally, of course, this was meant to be part of a full learning program, including preparation of sources, chavros, and everything else. We manage within the situation that we're in. But the whole idea is to take a useful, practical, relevant topic that is directly concerns all of us, and really try to get to grips with the sources, the background, the understanding behind, and the most important, the factors that are directly and the most important factors relevant to the topic at hand. One of the things, just to mention briefly, of course, the Asara B'Teves, one of the reasons for the fast on Asara B'Teves is because the translation of the Torah into Greek, which was took place under Ptolemy HaMelech, Ptolemy in Egypt, and the reason why this is specifically noteworthy in the context of us learning Torah this morning is because we understand that the main issue, if you like, or one of the key issues with that translation was the idea that the Torah could be restricted in some way. When you translate something, it's always restricted, limits are placed upon it. So when we come together and learn, effectively, what we're doing is I think, demonstrating that the Torah is indeed limitless, and if there's no better way than demonstrating that nowadays, than it literally being limitless and flying through cyberspace as we are together this morning. So the boundaries that were attempted to be imposed on the Torah have been released this morning. So we're going to go through the sources. I hope that you have those sources. Would you like me to put them up on the screen? Was that easier? Is that a good idea, or are we happy with looking at that? Well, let's just think. What is the easiest way of doing this? We could put them up on the screen. Let's put it up on the screen. Some if you think this is easier. Is that good? Can people see the sources like this? Someone wave their hand.
Yeah, that's good.
I can see.
Yeah, is that helpful? Okay, good. All right. So, so what we're going to do here is really talk about several different aspects of this that are relevant. I'm also noteworthy I also want to note, sorry, that I'm we're in the presence of a number of doctors and medical professionals, and I do want interjection and comments, particularly in those areas where it's useful, helpful, relevant, and particularly if I say something that's incorrect. One thing I think it seems undeniable is that the World Health Organization has noted that, even leaving aside this the particular situation that we're in, is that hesitancy and concern about taking vaccines is one of the top threats to global health. That is a major concern, and therefore verifying the facts is fundamentally important. So, for a moment, we need to play devil's advocate a little bit in terms of risk evaluation. And this is not to say that there are major risks associated with this vaccine. It's been made clear time and time again that the vaccine is safe as far as we can tell, as far as the research that's been done, the extensive testing and everything else. But if we wanted to play devil's advocate a little bit, we'd have to ask ourselves, and because the vaccine is indeed new, and therefore there will always be some level of unknown, there will be some unknowns about it. So we have to ask ourselves, what are halachic approaches to risk evaluation in general? How do we approach risk? How do we approach risk generally in a halachic sense? And for this, we need to look at the following few sources. This first page is actually I'm going to take this off the screen share at the moment, mainly because I'm going to really just summarize this. We're not very long, so really I'm going to just summarize these sources, and then we'll come back onto the screen share when something I want to go through things in more detail. The first source is really there is Gemara and Avodah Zarah. It's a source for allowing risky treatment in the hope of a long-term cure, right? Even when it carries a possible risk of immediate death. All right, and again, I must recall. I'd like to restate: we're talking here about playing devil's advocate in the sense that let's say, how do we weigh up risk? The Gemara says that in a situation where you have there were pagan doctors who were in the time of the Gemara, who there was a real concern that they were out, if you like, to get their Jewish patients. And in that situation, the Gemara says, if there's a sofik chai, a sofik meis, it's doubtful whether the person will live or die. One cannot risk one's life to receive healing from them. But if vadai meis, if a person is in a situation of effectively of certain death. Unless they take some treatment, there is certain death. Mitzrapin mehen. You can take hope, so you can take a cure from them. The hope is that through taking that treatment, there will be a long-term cure, even though it is acknowledged by the Gemara there is a significant risk there of immediate death. That sadly was what used to happen. They would try possibly to kill the patient. The Gemara asks, if a person, if he's going to die, well, the problem is if there's a risk, if there's a risk of death, there's the concern about Chai Shah. Surely the fact that they're going to there is certainly at least a temporary existence this person is going to have, even if you say they're definitely going to die, but at the moment they're alive. The Gemara says for that we're not concerned. The Gemara brings a source in Melachim that for that concern of the fact that they will temporarily survive, l'chai shah, we're not concerned about that. In other words, even though at the moment the person is alive, since in this situation we're discussing their life has been, unfortunately, they won't live very long, they are permitted to take a risky treatment, a very risky treatment, in the hope of a possible long-term cure. So you see that when it comes to evaluating risk, there are scenarios when we weigh them up and we say, okay, it's true, there are risks both ways. But in the long term, at the end of the day, this gives the person a possibility of survival. Obviously, that's very case specific. It's very much depends on the circumstances at hand. But you see that the Gemara acknowledges that risk is inevitable, right? Risk, it's certainly, especially in a medical context, is always inevitable. There always will be some level of risk. The whole question is, how do you evaluate that risk? Now, when it comes to the question of about endangering, or a question of an obligation, whether there's an obligation to endanger one's own life, either to save another or indeed to save oneself, there is a fascinating debate between the Yerushalmi and the Bavli. So the Gemara in the Dorim says, brings a situation of a spring that belongs to a certain town or whatever, and the Gemara concludes from that situation where the water can only go to one group. We say the principle of Chayecho Kodmin, your life comes first. One's own life comes before, protecting one's own life comes before saving the life of another. But the Yerushalmi seems to bring a different view. The Yerushalmi brings a story of someone called Rabbi Issi, who is captured, and Rabbi Yonason says, he's gone, what can we do? He uses the phrase, let the dead be wrapped in his shroud. In other words, there's nothing we can do. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, though, either I will kill or I will be killed, but I will go and rescue him by force. So in other words, Reish Lakish, this is a very different approach. He is saying that even though there's a risk to his own life, there's a clear and present risk, he says, I'm going to prepare to put myself in danger to save someone else. So that seems to be a contradiction between the earlier Gemara. Can one risk one's own life to save someone else? And we'll see in a moment how and where this is directly relevant to the question of vaccination. And indeed, this same debate plays out later in the halachic authorities as well. The final source on page 1, if you're following, is from the Yerushalmi. It's from, the Hagos Maimonides. It's actually from the Sma, but he quotes the Hagos Maimonides, who basically says that the Yerushalmi concludes that you have to put yourself even in a situation of possible danger in order to save someone else, using the phrase tzorech, one needs to. And the Beis Yosef brings this as well. And the reason, he says, the logic is because the risk of life to yourself is only possible where there is a definite danger to the other individual concerned. Now, the reality is, though, that this idea and this requirement, to say it's a requirement to put yourself in danger to save someone else, that is actually not recorded in Shulchan Aruch. And the suggestion he makes is that the reason why the Shulchan Aruch doesn't record it is because the Rif, the Rambam, the Rosh, the classic halachic, the classic pillars of halacha do not bring it either. And it may well be because they hold like the Gemara in the Dorim. We always say, Chayecho Kodmin, your life comes first. To put your own life in clear and present danger, even if it's only a possible life, to obligate one to do that we don't go so far. We don't obligate you to put your life in danger in order to save someone else, even if your risk is much lower than theirs. So you see, once again, we have the way always going back to the original sources, we have this evaluation of risk. Evaluation of risk is an essential and necessary part of any decision that's made in a context, in a medical context, right? Whether it was in those days in terms of risky medication, whether it was in terms of rescuing others, saving others, which involves endangering one's own life, there are always risks. There are always risks involved. Now, how does this relate specifically to our case at hand? So what we need to do is we need to look at some of the historical examples as far back as we can go of vaccination or early vaccination type treatments. One of the most fascinating sources that we have was the sefer called Ale L'Trufa. It's a bit difficult to read on the sheet. I'm going to put the screen up for this bit. Let me just find this. There we go. Yeah. So Ale L'Trufa is on page 2 if you're following in the source sheets inside, or you can probably see it on the screen. Written by someone called Rabbi Nansig. Rabbi Nansig tragically lost 2 children himself to smallpox. He wrote this in 1785, which is 11 years before Edward Jenner introduced the smallpox vaccine. And he says the following thing. B'shana Hashenis, hope you can see my mouse pointer at the top. Shana Hashenis will be Yossi Sham. Says, I came to a certain place, Nishma Kol Hamul, I heard these terrible cries, Kol Anus Chalushim Machneh Ivrim. I heard terrible pain and suffering in Jewish towns. Kol Mirosh Habakoyim, there was terrible weeping, Yegu Ech Nechoim, and Yaldei Sharshum, young children. Shoyakimat Magifa, there was basically a plague. Magifa Katana, Rachmana Litzlon, Hashem save us. Yelodim Icholi Aval boys in children from sickness, literally means blisters or boils. Of course, it means smallpox. And he says there were so many of our people on Nafshum al Zarom, Vishtamshu Bitrufa Chadosha, and they were using this new medication. They were using a new medication in order to try and help treat it. And it was working, it was saving them. What was the new treatment that they were using? The treatment they were using was what we call variolation. Effectively, this is the precursor to vaccination. What variolation is basically the deliberate infection of a healthy individual with smallpox or cowpox, whatever, cause a mild form of the disease, that then would create immunity, some form of immunity. Now, this was a risky procedure in those days. This was clearly had carried significant risk. And he says, therefore, for Rabbi, in fact, according to the statistics, it was associated with about 1 in 1,000 dying as a result of this treatment. So he says like this, Rabbi Nansig says like this, many people don't want to do it. Why? It's a new thing. As they say in the vernacular, it's a nayazach. Our fathers don't know anything about this. We never heard of such a treatment. Why are we getting involved? Now, it's a fascinating little anecdote in brackets here, he says. He says that is not a wise response, right? Because because you can clearly see that situations have arisen nowadays. He uses quite a poetic, his turn of phrase is quite poetic, that which we're doing all things sort of thing nowadays that no one had ever heard of before. He says our ancestors never spoke about mimigdol hapereach ba'avir, from a tower flying in the sky. Now recall that this was written in 1785. 1783, just 2 years before, is the first hot air balloon flight. Your brothers fly a hot air balloon in Paris. So he's saying, you're telling me you're worried about a new treatment that no one's ever heard of. We just seen a hot air balloon go in the sky. A migdal hapereach ba'avir, a tower flying in the sky. Beautiful phrase, right? He says, obviously no one's ever heard of that. Everyone would think they'd make a barrel which could float, a barrel which could fly in the sky, right? And like you can go in the sea. And he says there's so many other things as well, but they're doing it. So he says that alone, to say that this is something new and therefore we're not going to get involved and therefore we're going to be we're going to sit back and say, oh, we don't know about this. That's clearly incorrect. But he says that I've been asked for my view on this, etc., etc., etc. Let's not go through every line. So he says, I've had this request. This request has been posed to me. That's in the second paragraph, and he says, originally he says I didn't respond. There seems to have been a period of where the illness, obviously went in waves, and there was a time, as we're familiar with, it went in waves, and there was a time when things were easier. He says, whilst it was, this is the fourth line of the second paragraph, I basically left it alone for a while. Then suddenly everything became terrible again. Yes, uses the phrases of illness, sickness in the Torah. Also, has caused terrible wounds in the Jewish people. And then he writes these incredibly painful lines. He says, my own son passed away, he says, after he's already lost his daughter as well. And therefore he says, I realize the time is, I have to write and I have to speak out. You feel the pain in his words. You feel the fact that he's talking about something which is incredibly and deeply personal. And also this idea that it goes in waves and it's unpredictable. He basically writes this whole pamphlet or sefer, whatever, is basically to justify why it's acceptable to do so. One of the proofs he brings, he says, I'll bring you another proof, he says, I've had testimony which has come from someone called Sholem Buzagli, who wrote the sefer Mikdash Melech. This is on the left-hand column on the sheets. And he says, he told me in the land of his birth, this medicine is spread. What they used to do, and this has been done for many, many, many years, what they used to do was that this was a very primitive form of variolation. They used to fill a child's hand who was suffering with smallpox with raisins. And he would hold the raisins in his hand, about a quarter of an hour, until his hand became warm with that. And they would give it to another child who had not yet become sick. And basically, the child would eat these raisins. He would experience a mild infection and suffer immunity. And he says that this took place in the town of the great Yitzchok Alfasi. This is already in the 11th century, right? And the fact that this took place in his town shows that he was supportive of it. It must be that he was supportive of it. And therefore he concludes that it is absolutely acceptable to fulfill this, to use this treatment. So that's one of the earliest sources we have on a vaccination-like treatment being supported, even though, again, going back to those ideas of risk evaluation, it carried a significant risk. Nevertheless, it was considered to be an acceptable practice. The Tiferes Yisrael is the next major source about this. The Tiferes Yisrael, Lifshitz, was a contemporary of Edward Jenner, right? In two places, at least, he makes reference to him. In Pirkei Avos, Perek Gimel, Posuk Aleph, Mishnah Aleph, he talks concept of Chasidei Umos Ha'olam, the pious people, the pious members of the nations of the world. This is on source 6a on the sheets. And he says that even if Chazal hadn't told us that the Chasidei Umos Ha'olam, the pious members of the nations of the world, the righteous of the non-Jews that would have a portion of the world to come, we would have known this anyway, he says, mitzad ha'seichel, just from logic. He says, fourth line down, Hashem is righteous in all his ways, he's pious in all his actions. We see many of their pious ones, apart from the fact that they recognize Hashem, the author, the founder of creation, and they believe in the Torah, and they do kindness with the Jewish people. He says, look at the incredible good things they have done for the world, for the people in the world. Yeah, this is a lesson alone in how a Rav can approach the wider picture and write so powerfully and beautifully about the contributions made to humanity by individuals far beyond his own faith. HaChosid Yana, he says, Jana, like Jana, Shem, see, you can read that word, then you're a better man than me. Basically, Pakanin Fumfunk, which seems to me something like the Pakanin seems to be the name for smallpox, and basically it's the vaccination for smallpox. Again, he's a contemporary. He saves so many tens of thousands from sickness, illness, and death. And then he brings Drake, who brought the potato to Europe. Drake which has prevented famine so many times, and Gutenberg, and Gutenberg, who produced the printing press. And he goes on to discuss how these great and incredible people, look at the contribution they have made to humanity. Elsewhere in Yuma, the Tiferes Yisrael goes into more detail about the specific halachic ramifications of the vaccination. He says, going on the mission in Yuma, which discusses about life, he says, from there it would seem to me permissible heter la'asos inoculation shel oken, the smallpox inoculation, even though there's a situation, a significant risk, a risk of one in 1,000 dying, which again, we have to stress this again, that is massively higher than any projection of risk in any way in the current situation we're talking about. That's a huge risk if you think about it, 1 in 1,000 people. He says, look at this, evaluate risk. If the natural smallpox affects people, the risk is much greater. Clearly, that's much greater than the 1 in 1,000 risk from the vaccination. Therefore, he says, one is allowed to enter into a distant danger, in other words, a danger that's less likely, to save oneself from a danger that is much more likely. And he says, I'll bring you a proof. And now he goes back, and that's why I wanted to bring those, start off with the sources we were originally. He says, I'll prove to you from that Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi says, a person is obligated, according to Yerushalmi, to put himself in a doubtful, possible danger to save someone else from definite danger, right? Because when he is in, that was like Yerushalmi, we said not everyone agrees. Yerushalmi says, if one sees someone else drowning in a river, it's a dangerous business to go and save him, but the other guy's definitely going to die. And that was what the Yerushalmi held. And he says like this, where my pointer is, if to save someone else, there's an obligation to put oneself in even a situation of doubtful danger. How much more so one would have permission, that one would be allowed to place oneself in a potentially risky situation, right? In order to save oneself, if one can even do it to someone else. So and with that, he preempts the question which everyone is going to ask, which is, the Rif and the Rambam and the Torah don't bring that Yerushalmi. We said not everyone agrees. He says that's because they hold like Rabbi Yossi in Nedarim, the other view that we mentioned earlier, that we say, that your life comes before someone else's. But to save someone else's life, also one's own life, even though it may not be an obligation to take these steps, it's certainly rashoy, it's certainly permitted. Even according to the Rif and the Rambam, you can say they could even agree that one is allowed to put oneself potentially in a possible danger to save someone else from definite danger, and therefore, how much more so one would be permitted to put oneself in a possible situation of danger to save oneself from a much bigger, sort of clear and present situation. Again, we have to be careful with parallels, because apart from anything else, he is discussing a situation where the risk was far higher than the situation we're talking about nowadays. And even so, he says it would certainly be permitted to do so. But what's also significant from this piece in the Tiferes Yisrael, apart from the tracing it in a halachic sense to the earliest halachic authorities we have on this topic, is we see that the halachic approach it, the halacha, according to him, approaches disease prevention in the same way or a similar way that it approaches treating an active disease, right? He's using the same frame of reference, right, in terms of disease prevention, inoculation, vaccination, which the sources, if you like, the classic sources would apply to an active present disease now, which is a significant point. So the question is, how do we move beyond that into other considerations that are directly relevant here? when it comes to when we have to really consider. Again, it's difficult to put numbers on terms of risk. Risk here. What we clearly understand is that, as I said before, is that the risk involved in the current situation of the vaccination is massively lower than the scenarios that were discussed 300 years ago. But nevertheless, what we need to ask ourselves is this question of obligatory or optional. What behavior is expected of us during a pandemic? How far are we supposed to go in order to ensure that we remain safe? Again, another huge topic. And we know we talk how careful we have to be. But there are other sources as well, which are directly relevant to this particular scenario. During a pandemic, there is a recognition that there is a heightened, if you like, urgency in terms of doing whatever we can to make sure that we don't walk blindly into a dangerous situation. The Ramah says in Yeridea Hilchos Tarovet as follows. He brings the poskim who say that to run away from a city if there's a plague in the city. And he says you should leave the city at the beginning. At the beginning of the plague, not at the end. It's all because of danger. Someone who guards oneself should be careful and distance themselves from them. One cannot rely on a miracle or to put oneself in danger in any scenario like that. What do we see from here? And we have a similar thing in the Be'er Hativ. That's the next source 8. He says, brings the shlo. He talks here specifically, it seems, about smallpox as well. You see once again how much of a plague this was, how horrific this was. So you should decree a fast day. But he says the shlo writes, if there's a plague in the city of smallpox, everyone has to run away. They don't do so. They're liable. They're guilty. In other words, again, not that that's a direct parallel to here, but it shows us the tone. The tone is that in a scenario of a pandemic, of an epidemic, there is even more concern to do whatever we can to stop and prevent death. So what does that mean in terms of the responsibility, though, that we have to protect others? Because that's the other factor here that is being that we have to consider when we talk about the vaccination. Clearly, we're talking partially about protecting ourselves, but in many situations, we're also talking about protecting others. Someone might come along and say, "I understand vaccination. If they would say like this, if I was in a high risk category, I would vaccinate myself. But at the end, I would take the vaccination. But at the end of the day, there might be some remote risk involved here. There might be some remote risk. There might be some, can we say 100% it's completely safe? Who can ever give that 100% guarantee? So they'll say, listen, I prefer myself to not take it. The question is, though, what is our responsibility to protect others? And how does that have a bearing on the considerations here as well? There's a little infographic here, which basically presents something which should be relatively straightforward to understand. We've seen many of these type of things already. We've seen these things many times. In a situation where no one is immunized, it can spread very rapidly. It can still spread if some of the population gets immunized. If most gets immunized, you get to that tipping point, the herd immunity, and the spread is contained. So it is a communal, global responsibility here. Where do we see the attitude of the Torah to that type of situation? The Gemara says in the Sanhedrin, source 9, how do you know if you see someone drowning in a river, or a wild animal dragging someone illicit in boy or love, or bandits coming upon them, one is obligated to save him. The Pasuk says, do not stand idly by the blood of your brother, of your friend, of someone else. To stand by and watch others suffer is anathema to what we believe, to what we stand for. You see someone else drowning, you can save them, then you rescue them. We had a question earlier about where you yourself are putting yourself in danger. But here, We're not talking about such a situation, or not necessarily talking about such a situation. That would be if a person is able to jump in and save that person, then that is what they need. That is what they need to do. The Sefer HaChinuch gives us the rationale for this. He explains, Shoresh mitzvah zu yodua, this mitzvah lo sama l'adam riachot, do not stand by while others are in danger. What is the rationale? If you save someone else, your friend will save you too. And that's what will lead the world to become settled, to be established, in other words, to people to be able to survive and thrive. Hashem wants the world to be inhabited, to be settled. It was created to be lived in, to be settled. He says, you want to understand the rationale? It's simple. We're all in this together. We're all in the world together. The world, there's a mitzvah to make sure the world remains inhabited, settled, lived in. If a person drills a hole in their own boat and says, I'm all right, Jack, listen, I'm okay, but and I don't have to worry about someone else, I want to look after myself, that's anathema to what we believe in. Sefer Hasidim, very important early halachic, ethical more than anything, or has halacha in as well. But it's really sets the tone so much in terms of the period of the Rishonim about the moral and ethical behavior. Sefer Hasidim, 12th, 13th century says the following thing. It says, source 11, shouldn't put a stumbling block in front of the blind. What does that mean? He says, I'll give you a practical application, what it means to put a stumbling block in front of the blind. Someone who is suffering from an infectious disease is not allowed to wash in a bathhouse with someone else, another Jew, unless he tells him. The Apostle says, do not stand by the blood of your friend. In other words, at the absolute minimum, if a person would be in a situation of danger to someone else, the minimum they need to do is tell them, don't come near me. I'm infectious, right? That's the absolute minimum. How he says the Sefer Hasidim, how can a person possibly countenance going to a place, going to a situation where they know they're infectious and causing risk to someone else's life? The Rambam says, he brings 24 situations to put people in chayrim. And he says one of them is someone who's got something that can cause that endangers others, could go in kelev ra, a dangerous dog, or sulam ru'ua, or a dodgy ladder, menadin osoi, ad sheyoser hazeko. You put him in chayrim until he removes that risk, that danger. Powerful words. If a person has a dangerous dog, you can even put them in chayrim. You can't allow yourself to be a threat and danger to others. Again, what we're establishing here is a tone. It's not that they're talking about our particular circumstances. It is a tone that goes through Chazal, through the Rishonim. Sensitivity towards others, particularly in cases of causing illness to others, is hugely important. Another aspect that's directly relevant here is we live in a world of fake news. We live in a world, as we know, where people will put together all sorts of crackpot theories. Let's be honest, right? That is the worst thing about social media. Yeah, you're going to see everything under the sun. This causes this. The damage. We're all aware of the horrific danger and damage that was caused by the spurious claims about the MMR vaccine and everything else. Once something is out there, and I know the doctors on this call will I'm sure support this. Once something is out there, a rumor, sadly, especially those who are medically illiterate, will pick up on it. They will pass it on, and unfortunately, it's just getting worse. It's getting worse all the time. So, what is our approach? What is our approach? What do you do? I'm not a medical professional. Many of us are not medical people, and therefore, what do we do? What do we do? Someone phones us up one day and says, "Yeah, but Dr. So and so somewhere else in Brazil, in whatever it is, he says it's dangerous." So, what do you do? Says the Mishnah Berurah in Hilchos Yom Kippurim. He's talking about when you make a decision about someone fasting on Yom Kippur. He says if this doctor is muflag b'chochma, he is a better doctor than everyone else. We are concerned about for his words, even if they're the majority against him. right? In a situation where there's a debate between doctors as to whether a patient needs to eat on Yom Kippur or not, right? So even if the one who is a more expert doctor, okay, he is a better doctor, if you like. He's considered to be a more senior expert in his particular field of medicine, and he says, this patient, I'm telling you, this patient needs to eat. Even if there's a majority against him who says the patient doesn't need to eat, we ignore them and we follow him. Let's say the one who's the expert doctor, who is the senior in the field, says the patient doesn't need to eat, I think they can fast. Two that are not less expert, they say, but there are two of them, they say he needs to eat. You go after the majority and you give him to eat. Our concern over pikuach nefesh guides us in this situation, right? So if the senior doctor says he needs to eat, ignore the majority. If the majority says he needs to eat, go with the majority and ignore him. But what do you see? You see that when it comes to medical opinion, you go with the mainstream body of medical opinion. Sometimes in this situation, it needed to be sorted through the majority view, something needed to be sorted through the senior view. In that case, you always go with what's needed. The risk to life outweighs. If there's a risk to life, you go with whatever's necessary to save the patient's life. The Igros Moshe brings in one of his famous shuvas about Tay-Sachs, testing for Tay-Sachs. He says, you could have just paraphrased this. He says, you could have argued against me about doing genetic testing, and you could say like this: we could apply the pasuk Tomim tia im Hashem Elokecha. You shall be just act simply with Hashem your God, act in a pure heart. Why are you getting involved? Why are you genetically testing people in advance? Surely we should simply say, whatever. If Hashem wants it to happen, it will happen, right? Go tmimus. Don't start lo tachkar achar asilas. He says, don't start inquiring after future things. He says that is what you're saying by arguing that in this case. He says now that we have the ability, we can do genetic testing. It's like closing one's eyes to something that one can see, when one can prevent terrible illness and suffering. And therefore, he says one should publicize that one can do this. One can do the genetic testing for Tay-Sachs. The principle again is the same idea. To start saying, "Oh, we'll just close our eyes to it," when we can do something about it, it's clearly an incorrect approach. So the argument here would have been that we can invoke what's called the pasuk of Shomer P'soim Hashem. We say Hashem protects the foolish. So, it's a low-level risk, and that is invoked on occasion. If it's a low-level risk, we say Hashem provokes Hashem protects the foolish. And to do that in this situation, and to say, we can just sort of, if you like, bury our heads in the sand, seems to be an incorrect approach. And in fact, Rabbi Weiss in his recent tshuva about this particular vaccine, he indeed argues that we go with the mainstream medical opinion. That is one of the principles, he says, of halachic decision making. That we rely on we rely on the expert scientific and medical advice, and therefore, as we mentioned before, in the case of Yom Kippur, that is the correct approach to be taken here. He argues another point here, which is also relevant, is that the concept of Shomer P'soim Hashem means that Hashem literally means Hashem guards the foolish, means that if we do the right thing, if we follow what the Torah says, if we follow the common practice, the mainstream view, the situation that we are being, that both our halachic and medical advisors are guiding us to do, then even if there would be there possibly would be a potential risk or danger, we are doing the right thing, and we can rely on the idea of Shomer P'soim Hashem, that Hashem will guard the foolish, in the sense that we can hope for divine protection. What do we have in terms of, and interestingly enough, actually, there is an evidence of just as a little historical anecdote before we see the final sources. In 1896, you might be interested to know, there was an Orthodox Jew in London who was imprisoned for refusing to vaccinate his child. Which actually seems it'll serve as a useful introduction to the final points I want to make. And the chief rabbi of the time said and gave testimony in court and said the vaccination is in perfect consonance with the letter and spirit of Judaism. That's a British connection there. He was in prison for refusing to vaccinate the child. He got up in court, the chief rabbi of the time, and said it is perfectly acceptable in Jewish practice and faith to vaccinate one's children. Question is, can one obligate others to vaccinate? Can one actually obligate others to vaccinate? There are this is debated a lot amongst contemporary poskim. There are two sources here that are not specific to the COVID vaccine, but have been expressed in other contexts. Rabbi Akiva, actually, let's start with the Nishma Savrom on the right-hand side. The Nishma Savrom, who is, it's an incredibly important medical work on the on Shulchan Aruch, and he says like this, that he brings a situation. He says that in a situation where you have, the question is, how far is it the right of parents to say, well, we don't want to vaccinate our children? What can you do? Can you force them to do so? So Rav Neuver says that because they are, if they're in a situation, he says that he holds, Rav Neuver holds, in Halacha, Rav Neuver was the primary Talmud of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. He holds that in halachic sense, one is not able to force them to vaccinate, even though you should do everything you can to try and convince them to do so. Okay, and he brings other examples of other vaccinations as well. Do everything in your power, but you can't physically force them to do so. You just have to do everything you can to try and convince them to do so. Rabbi Elyashiv, on the other side, the left-hand side, Rabbi Akiva Tatz, has this, but I think based on a private personal conversation he had with Rabbi Elyashiv, and he quotes him as ruling that parents should accede to immunization despite their concerns. Rabbi Elyashiv says this reason is that since immunization of children is normal practice throughout the world, that's what we do. We follow normative course. And to not do so amounts to negligence. Refusing child immunization on the basis of unsubstantiated fears of vaccine side effects is irresponsible and out of order halachically. And the danger of precipitating epidemics, etc., is far more real than the dangers attributed to vaccines on the basis of anecdotal claims. Until objective evidence to the contrary accrues, the halachically correct approach is to do what is normal. And of course, you have the legitimate government legislation that is also significant as well. In the last reference as well, quoted in an article that's written by someone called Osher Bush, he writes that, he quotes Rabbi Elyashiv as saying that in the majority of children in a class have been vaccinated, then, and there are individual children, the parents do not wish them to have the vaccination, the other parents can seek from those individuals to act like the majority and not to turn themselves and their families into a danger and damage and danger to others. The clear outcome of this, which as far as everything I can see in everything that's been publicized, has been publicized, and around the Jewish world on the concept of vaccination. In fact, there is a real campaign underway, which I think is absolutely very admirable, and sadly needs to be done to combat misinformation, and unfortunately that misinformation permeates through our community, through the Jewish community as well. We need to fight that. We need to combat that. The voices coming out from on a rabbinic front almost exclusively clear in the sense that they're saying that it is a fundamental principle of our faith to preserve our health and the health of those around us from everything we've seen here. And therefore, absolutely, people should be taking this vaccination. Whether or not you can say that one specifically can obligate others to do so, if they say they personally don't want to do so, they say we are going to stay, far away from everyone else, we're going to make ourselves completely safe, we're going to cover out, whether you can actually obligate them or not, in a sense, is slightly immaterial, because it's absolutely clear that one should be taking it, that people should be taking the vaccine, and we should do whatever we can in order to do this. The way Rav Osher Weiss phrases it is that it is halachically correct to be immunized with the vaccine. We got time for a couple of questions. Richie, I see you got your hand up.
An argument that's been put forward is Shevar Tasa, the concept in Halacha of Shevar Tasa. Obviously, is inconsistent, completely contrary to what you've been saying. But how would you What would the halachic answer to Sheva Tasa be?
Yeah. So again, the question of Shev al Tasa, there is a delicate balance between you say Shev al Tasa means you should better not. Well, you don't know, so better to do nothing, right? But that's why that tshuva, for example, of Ramosha about Tay-Sachs, genetic testing for Tay-Sachs is so important. Okay, you need to put yourself in the mind of Ramosha, the great posek, at the time when it was first introduced. Okay, the weight and the numbers of people must have been saying, oh, what do you mean? Genetically test people before they get married? I mean, this is mind-blowing. We take it for granted now. Moshe says you can't bury your head in the sand, right? In a case where there's a clear and present danger that you can clearly do something to protect against. And say, hold on a minute, there is a remote risk, and because there's a remote risk, better to say Shev al Tasa, don't do it, right? The answer is there is always a risk. How we are halachically obligated to act is in accordance with the mainstream medical opinion. The mainstream medical opinion holds that this is a safe thing and the correct thing to do. And as Rosh Hashanah says, that's what we should be doing, right? That's what we should be doing. And to argue, oh no, Shev al Tasa, to say instead, so I prefer to do nothing. I prefer to do nothing. Not only risks oneself, but risks others as well. In order to achieve the level of immunity necessary, as we know, sadly, there will be many who will not be taking this vaccine. There will be some, unfortunately, will not be taking this vaccine for whatever reason, whether it's conspiracy theories, whether they just don't do that, so whatever it is, we need to combat that in whatever way we can. So, to say Shev al Tasa in this situation, I think is incorrect. Yeah. Any other questions? Benji.
Hi. If they start vaccinating people 7 days a week, would a person be able to have it on Shabbos? Would they be allowed to have it done on Shabbos if they get their calling cards?
That's a really good question. Potentially, if it didn't involve, the actual vaccination, it would seem, is not a melacha d'oraisa. It's probably a melacha d'rabbanan, just in the way this particular vaccination works, and that would mean that you could probably. Potentially could be, if that was the only option. If, let's say, they were offering a person a vaccination on Shabbos, and you know that if you didn't get it on Shabbos, you'd have to wait, let's say, another several weeks or months or whatever it was, then potentially one could even take it on Shabbos. You would obviously need to mitigate as much as possible. You need to walk there, whatever it is, or, the person is completely healthy, then we would obviously, as things currently stand, you need to mitigate as much as possible. But potentially, it is that serious that it could, and I say could, because it would need to ask a case specific shaila, if it actually arose in practice, potentially could even be administered and taken on Shabbos. Yeah. Any other questions? Any other questions we have here? Anyone else? Okay. Yeah, Dr. Rees, do you want to ask something?
No, I just want to say it was so concise and erudite that I actually don't have any questions.
All right. Thank you, very kind. And as I said, really the aim of this, I think, was, we will see, we have already seen over the, the past week or the next few weeks, lots and lots of things going around about vaccination, about whatever, this. I think it's important to be clear on the sources, the background. I myself have added my own name to a letter that's gone around for the Rabbi in Northwest London, encouraging people to vaccinate. And that's what and halachically that's the correct thing to do. It's important, I think, for us to also understand the background. Why are Rabbanim saying this? Where are we coming from? What is the background to the situation? As always, we, in particular case-specific scenarios, always ask a shaila. There are cases where the medical establishment have said there are concerns. We know there are people with particular allergies. Obviously, it goes without saying we follow the medical advice. One should always ask one's doctor any particular situation one has. Always ask your own doctor, but this gives you hopefully useful insight and background to the current situation and to this topic.
We have to remember people are dying from COVID-19, and right now it's really shot up again. A&Es are overflowing, ITUs are full. We're in a really critical moment right now. Apparently it's even worse than April right now. So I think that it's really important that people realize that the risk of getting the vaccination is way less than the risk of getting COVID. So you know,
And that's exactly, thank
Yeah.
you very much. And that's exactly why I wanted to begin with those very, very early, Makoros in the Yerushalmi, the Bavi, about risk. There's always a risk, right? We recognize risk. There's always a risk. It's a question of evaluating risk. And as Dr. Rees says, we are in a situation where the risk is clearly much higher if people do not vaccinate than if they do. And that's why we're absolutely encouraging the vaccination. Thank you very much. I wish you all a good Shabbos. Fast well. We should no more fast days. Always be only simchas and for shame for all those who need it. And besoros tovas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Amen.
Thank you. Good job.
Good Shabbos.